So this reading is chapter 2 of Begin a New Life, titled Pain and Prayer, Edgar Cayce's Personal Mysticism. If ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me, a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. Man's pageant meaning public performance for entertainment, must pass and fade, but God works in a slower and more secret way his wondrous works to perform. He blows no trumpet, he rings no bell, he begins from within, seeking his ends by quiet growth. There is a strange power that men call weakness, a wisdom mistaken for folly. Man has one answer to every problem, power. But that is not God's way. Then why shouldn't I dread publicity? You ask, I am sure, have there been failures? If there were not failures, friends, I would be afraid there was something supernatural about me. I am only human. Humanity is doomed to failure when it trusts in its own weak self, and most of us have that failing. Besides giving 2 readings every day and talking with hundreds of people who came asking for readings and inquiring about the hospital, I attempted to handle for a time much of the business details of the institution. Yet as I look back over the turmoils and tribulations, the disappointments and periods of despair, the good which was accomplished stands out above everything else. I tried to take stock of myself and the work. Even then I wondered, am I all wrong? As much as any person who came to him for his trance-attuned aid, Cayce had to seek for himself more than once the conditions of beginning a new life. What were those conditions of beginning a new life, as he worked them out for himself? The answers may be found in his letters to hundreds of people, in records kept of Tuesday evening sessions of a Bible class that met in his home, in his memoirs and in his records of his dreams, in readings which he asked to be taken about himself. While all these sources are useful, they add only details and perspectives to enrich the themes which Cayce set forth himself in the friendly and undogmatic lectures in which he gave in the years 1929 to 1934 in the Sunday afternoon forum at the hospital named for him. So undogmatic meaning not giving a set of beliefs without regard to practical considerations. In these lectures, 3 conditions of personal growth were offered to others. 1. The condition of expecting direct and conscious attunements to God in transformative experiences great and small. 2. The condition of approaching faith as a continuous and graded search for God in steady growth rather than a once-for-all acceptance of dogmas or rites. Dogmas meaning set of principles laid down by an authority as absolutely true, and rites, ritual ceremonies or acts, especially being strictly religious. And 3. The condition of keeping a balanced focus on both pain and prayer by seeking to help others in a quiet interior partnership with God. Taken together, these 3 conditions added up to a balanced form of practical mysticism, in the term used by the English scholar William Inge to describe a particular kind of faith in his landmark historical study of 1899, Christian mysticism. To describe Edgar Cayce's personal faith as mysticism is to place it under 3 popular meanings of the term mysticism, none of which conforms to the way in which mysticism is used by scholars and historians. 1. One popular usage of mysticism confuses the mystical with mystery and suggests that mystics are those who reserve the esoteric teachings for initiates into their private circle of devotees. Mystery meaning something that is difficult or impossible to understand or explain. But like most historic mystics, Edgar Cayce wanted to share his faith he thought might be useful to others. Edgar Cayce had neither the desire nor the temperament to hide his ideas, though he did share in the preparation of 2 anonymous devotional books called A Search for God, Books 1 and 2. His hope to be heard could readily be seen in the fact that for more than 50 years he taught church schools classes wherever he lived. He did not write books about his thought or experiences, nor advertise or promote his readings, but he welcomed investigators and helped those few who did write about him. How far he was from reserving his ideas and those of his readings for the initiates of religious mysteries could be seen in the very name which he and his friends chose for the little group in which they worked for several years to begin to learn the laws and processes in prayer healing. Glad helpers. To a second popular usage of the term mysticism confuses it with the meaning of mystify, and sees a mystic as one who surrounds himself with strange symbols and rites designed to dazzle himself and his followers. Mystify meaning to cause someone to feel confused because they cannot understand something. Edgar Cayce's plain home, his plain dress, his plain library and office, his plain speech and homely illustrations for lectures and letters all make this concept to mystify of him inappropriate. Edgar Cayce was essentially a man of biblical faith, as the well-marked and thumbed Bible on his desk silently testified for those who looked when they visited him. The only solemn act which preceded his stretching out to give readings was a quiet prayer time, and the only ritual meal connected with his times being absent from the body was a snack of milk and crackers, which he sought just after giving readings because he was hungry. 3. A third popular usage of the term mysticism confuses it with magic. Magic meaning the power of influencing events by using mysterious or supernatural forces, therefore a suggestion of having supernatural powers. Suggesting that a mystic is one who has abandoned reason in favor of transactions with unknown forces which scorn intellectual inquiry and reflection. While Edgar Cayce was formerly uneducated, he had a quick mind that reached intuitively to grasp basic concepts in philosophy and medicine and psychology. When he took the trouble to concentrate on them, which seemed to occur only as a byproduct of his direct relations with people, rather than in study for its own sake. The barrier of being uneducated was no more a barrier to Cayce's use of reason and encouragement of reasoned inquiry than it was a barrier to that untutored German shoemaker mystic of an earlier century, Jacob Boehme, whose clairvoyant visions of both nature and the divine made immense demands, as did Cayce's readings, on the use of systemic reason and inquiry. So the 3 conditions of personal growth and a new life that we're going to be discussed are 1. Communion with God, 2. Search and growth towards God, and 3. Pain of others and prayer to God. 1. Communion with God. Where Cayce joined the ranks of those called mystics was in his insistence that direct and conscious communion, that is, transforming communion with the divine, was available to any man who would prepare for it by aligning his life with the will and nature of God. Consciousness of illumination by the direct action of divine has always been the hallmark of mysticism, as William James observed in his study occupied with occupied with mysticism, the varieties of religious experience. And he could not limit such conscious communion with God to a state after death, as he reminded our lecture audience by calling to mind the words of Jesus, God was God of the living, not of the dead. To be sure, Cayce thought of direct and conscious communion with God as occurring in altered states of consciousness, in entranced states familiar in the Bible and in the lives of devout men of prayer. In his view, the seeking person could expect such communion to come through some process of being lifted up or overshadowed or attuned through a gift of loving grace. But it was also part of his faith that a man should ever be ready to give a reason for the faith that is in him. On occasion he described those times which had made him sure that the loving presence of God was open to every man who earnestly sought him. He looked on such communion as at times as real, standing in the presence of the infinite, which would in time be quickened for any person who sought it not alone through devotions, but through the entire quality of his life. All that trends to purify and elevate the mind will assist us in this attainment and will facilitate the approach and reoccurrence of these happy conditions. There are then different roads by which this end may be reached. The love of beauty which exalts the poet, that devotion to the One, that ascent of present science which makes the ambition of the philosopher, that love and those prayers by which some devout and ardent soul tends in its moral purity towards perfection, these are all great highways conduction to the heights above the actual and the particular, where we may stand in the immediate presence of the infinite, which shines out from the depths of the soul. For the point of mystical states and events, in Cayce's view, was not self-realization, nor personal delight in the communion, real as these might be. The point was rather the one end which was nearest to the loving nature of God himself, active service to others. Now, in coming to know him, is it not evident that as we consider and help our fellow man, so do we carry out God's work? Our relationship to God then becomes our relationship to our brother. There is nothing that we can do for God, but there is much that we can do for his children, his created creatures, our brothers. Again and again, Cayce urged in such passages in his lectures, as well as in his teachings and conversations, that the purpose of mystical states and experiences was growth in fruits of the Spirit, so that one might better serve his fellows. Service was the key. Shall we go and do wonderful things? Shall we stand on the corner and preach? Of course, if we are called to do such things, then we should do them. Yet perhaps we shall just speak a kind word to our next door neighbor, to the child we meet in the street, to the lame dog we see, or to anything or anybody that is a manifestation of God. Just speaking the kind word that brings hope to those who are losing hope, speaking the cheery word to those who are discouraged. As we can do these things, we give out that which we have received. Freely you have received, freely give. For not all are called to be healers, nor all preachers. But each of us can do what our hands find to do, magnifying the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit, which are unseen. Just being kind, just being helpful. And this essential quality of his mysticism, Cayce the man took his place with the actives of the historic mysticism, rather than with their devout but very different contemporaries who have been the reflective contemplatives of mysticism. Cayce saw faith in terms of doing, in terms of work, in terms of concrete services and creations and relationships. For Cayce, the proper outcome of mystical communion was to be a channel of blessings to others. It is his purpose that we make ourselves a channel through which his Spirit may manifest. He would use us. When he spoke of the immediate presence of the infinite, as available to every man, Cayce was not espousing positive thinking or cheerful abandon to impulses from the unconsciousness. Seeking close attunement to the divine is a daily necessity. The mystical quest for immediate experience of God was not only a work of being devotional, but having the dependence on God. Edgar Cayce knew in a personal way how easy it was to become dead by just drifting, even for a short time. In a far more terrible sense, an individual becomes dead when he ceases to think and begins to drift with the stream. Like a sheep, he is willing to be led this way or that, influenced and controlled by people and forces around him. Too many are attracted by the life of ease, beside the dead and stagnant pools along the way, and we turn aside for a prolonged rest. Look around. Life is movement, vibrant aliveness. You can tear away the layers of protective covering from the inner creative spark which lies deep within you. You can realize your relationship with the Creative Spirit moving through all that is. Although he sometimes used the image of the soul as a divine spark, Cayce did not intend to suggest that mystical communion with God was the unveiling of layers within the person to accomplish a gnosis. Gnosis meaning knowledge of spiritual mysteries, or self-satisfying knowledge of God within. The God of biblical faith, in Cayce's view, required of each man a growth so extreme that it seemed to one's mind to be a loss of selfhood. We must lose the finite self and be willing to be used in whatsoever way or manner he sees fit. The growth, the change, the transformation, which was the grace working through all mystical states, would take away not selfhood but selfishness, the root of human evil and sin in Cayce's view. It is self-exaltation and it is selfishness that carry us away from the knowledge of God. For nothing in this world can keep us from God but ourselves. Whatever we may call hell, if we stumble into it, it will be over our own selves. It will be through the misuse or the misunderstandings that we have created within ourselves. 2. The personal search and growth towards God. The second emphasis which placed Cayce in the ranks of the mystics was his consistent view of faith as a search, as a growing into grace through fuller selfhood and covenants, rather than as either unveiling of truths or realities, or a once-for-all conversion to holiness. Mysticism in the great religions has been incredibly diverse in its tongues and doctrines and rites, or lack of rites. The Sufis of Islam, the Hasids, Essenes, and Covenanters of Judaism, the adherents of Chan and Zen Buddhism, the exponents of High Taoism, the sectarian Quakers, many varieties of Shaivite and Vishuite Hinduism, many serious followers of Hellenistic mystery religions from Persia, Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. What these mystics of many cultures have had in common has been two features of their faith. One, their insistence that in the present life every devout believer could expect direct and transforming communion with the divine, and two, the claim that there is a graded path for cultivation of direct encounter of God by a chain of awakenings which the seeker must put into practices of his daily life. In presenting his own faith as one which envisioned growth along a path to that led to God, Cayce turned to his Bible. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. To Cayce, this covenant was not only a central fact of the history of Israel, but potentially central in God's ways with any man. For he would remain to them a God if they would remain to him a people. There is something that man must do, as well as something that the Creator must do. There is a purpose in life. It is not a haphazard thing. That purpose was growing into lives filled with fruits of the Spirit. It was no mere obedience of precepts. Ye grow in grace. Cayce made the point that spiritual growth was becoming more of a person, more of an original creative agent, in order to share more with others. We are here to feed our souls with thoughts and deeds which could make a man like God. In such feeding of our souls, two processes were activated. They were awakening and application. In the work of awakening, each man would find aroused within him a succession of qualities and insights, calls and talents, appearing in a timing that was up to his own soul and to God, so that what may be true for one individual may not, in the experience of another, answer at all. What Cayce suggested was not the relativization to point out of truth, with which mystics have been charged, but that the truth which matters between man and God is existential, to make exist, truth, to be both awakened in the depths of the person and then lived out in daily application. In his view, concepts and traditions had their place, for they both stimulate and clarify the progression of man, each man's arousals to truth. But dogma and coercion of belief had no place. Dogma meaning set of principles laid down by an authority as absolutely true. Coercion, the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. This is truth, that which kept before your mental mind, your spiritual mind, will continue to develop you upward. He went on to explain that what he meant by developing upward was that which enabled you to hold the vision of what you worship as God. Only by such a deeply personal search for reality, aided by every means of self-analysis and interior communion with the divine, might one come to see that even truth itself may be a growth into that understanding which we will be able to apply in daily life. In Cayce's view of religious growth as a personal search, the gifts of awakening to final understandings about God and man might be trivialized if they were not completed by application in the principles and choices which governed an individual's life. Such applications were the most trying part of growth, requiring no less than the constant witness of the Holy Spirit, bearing witness with our spirits, as Cayce put it in the vividly mystical assurance of Paul in his letter to the Romans. For such disciplined application of ultimates which had been inwardly glimpsed, no lesser aid than the living God would be enough. No graven image would do, no fixed code, no hero, no institutional role, no success patterns. All such living by narrow religiosity would leave the soul falling short of its fullest growth in grace. Because if you make an image, it becomes your God. But if you have for your God that which is within your own individual self, you yourself being a portion of the Creator, you will continue to build upward to it. In suggesting that each man is a portion of the Creator, Cayce was touching a nerve which has always irritated the critics of mysticism. For as mystics have claimed that man could have a direct and conscious communion with God and have it in his life, they have had to offer the further claim of every man's essential likeness to God, which would enable each person to know God to be God when he found him. Some mystics have stressed man's complete and inclusive identity with God, making the mystical pilgrimage chiefly one of finding this underlying identity. Others, including Cayce, have emphasized the potential unison of man's likeness to the divine. Cayce told a lecture audience to recall the words of Jesus that God is a spirit and seeketh such to worship him. But he also had his own phrases which reserved for God differences of degree which amounted to a difference of kind, separating God from man. At times he spoke of man's destiny as becoming one with the whole, and yet not the whole. In Cayce's view, the essential point of contact between man and God was human will, which might be bent to conform to the overarching will of God. Will was more primary than knowledge, which would follow the humbling and training of the will. And this emphasis, Cayce took a position in the great debate which has always related mystics from each other, although it has rarely separated them as sharply as other believers have parted over questions of doctrine and worship and polity. He took his place within the biblical tradition where the drama is one of man's choosing to obey God with his free will rather than the one of religious drama of man's overcoming ignorance about God as about himself. In his approach to faith as a search, he took part in the preparation of A Search for God Books 1 and 2 with a small study group of friends and relatives. The impetus for them came from the conviction that Cayce's sense of faith as a search was sound and might be given concrete expression with the aid of his readings. The group sought and received readings on a specific ladder of themes of growth. The 12 steps for each book, beginning with such lessons as cooperation and know thyself, and proceeding on to the cross and the crown, and desire and destiny and love. Strongly biblical, the material which they secured from the information was also shaped to them as persons and as a group, through individual counseling that went with each lesson. They were told that they could not be given a new lesson or step until each one in the group and the group acting together had lived out or applied the previous one. They were required to devise among themselves exercises and assignments on each theme, leading to findings which they brought back to their group sessions. And they were required to keep the same daily times for prayer and meditation as part of their covenant of growth. The Cayce source proved every bit as demanding as the men and women who have served as spiritual counselors and trainers in the history of mysticism, but with the striking difference that the focus was less upon traditional disciplines of poverty, chastity, and obedience than upon the trying tasks of deep spiritual growth in the midst of business pressures, house cleaning chores, marital struggles, Boy Scout leadership, and the role clashes in school teaching and secretarial posts. Not surprisingly, when the criteria for receiving each additional lesson were so stringent, it took the group 14 years to get from the entranced Cayce the lessons for the 2 little books. And even when they won from him the subjects of the lessons, at times after being shown to their embarrassment that they were not so ready for new light as they might think, they were not allowed to publish their little manuals as quotations from Cayce readings. Instead, they were firmly enjoined to write up only their own actual experiences, their own truths, in their own words, and with their own treatments of the issues raised by each lesson. They were on no account to present what they had learned as doctrines, nor as having special authority from Cayce's strange trances, but to certify only to the value which they had actually found in their own lives in the years of their seeking awakening and application together. In preparing their little unsigned books, Cayce and his associates joined the many other anonymous writers and nameless authors of mystical treatises in other cultures in presenting faith as a search, a part of growth along steps and stages which the willing soul could follow through God's grace, proceeding through levels which earlier authors had called those of novice and proficient and adept, not in powers and skills, but in living communion with both God and the mystic fellows. Like many others of the mystical traditions before them, they made secondary the authority of tradition, the authority of learning, the authority of special states for receiving revelations, and offered first of all empirical authority, the tests of good fruits in individual lives. They reported on what they had found, and they added their own version of Cayce's familiar challenge: I don't do anything you can't do. but entrusting so heavily in the twin processes of awakening and application, stimulated by study and by the demands of daily living, to bring each soul along the ladder of growth toward God, Cayce and his friends laid themselves open to questions which have always been put to mystics. Were they offering a series of experiences by which each devotee would somehow recognize within himself a hidden truth, regardless of what others saw? Cayce's answer was to point to the more public and painful evaluation of each person's growth by his closest associates. In an autobiographical statement he wrote in just these terms about his own readings. Does the application of the information make individuals better husbands, wives, sons, daughters, citizens, friends? Deeds, thought, standards that build toward a better life, mental and spiritual light and understanding as measuring signs? Do the principles expressed in the readings bear the stamp of divine approval in the light of his standards? Repeatedly, Cayce insisted that if the ideas in his counsel answered to something deep within the person, when compared to the best that the person knew in his own tradition, then the seeker might investigate them further, otherwise he ought to be let them alone. And Cayce put it just that flatly. In addition, as he saw it, an individual confronted by a new work or body of thought ought not only to base his judgment upon practical empirical consequences for his life, supplemented by judgment drawn from his own religious tradition and teachings. The seeker ought to turn within himself, waiting upon the answering witness of the Spirit. Do not seek a reading to satisfy some emotional whim or idle curiosity. To be of real value, the information must strike a vibrant chord within your inner being, ringing true with your spiritual desire. And there was yet a further aid for the discovery of truth, the aid of reason, systematically applied to experiments and investigations, which were faithfully carried out. Cayce warned that rational inquiry into new ideas and phenomena required discipline. Determine that you will follow the suggestions given in the readings without being moved by the criticisms or scorn of others who cannot understand your point of view. That which an individual seeks, he will find. Those that seek only that which is of the earthy may only find such. They that seek to bring a whole, well-rounded life may find it. These criteria of truth and growth along the mystical path, life fruits, supplemented by tradition, spirit, and reason, were Cayce's version of what might be trusted in the pilgrimage away from selfishness to whole soul service to others. Together they added up to balanced mysticism, practical mysticism, service mysticism, which could bring an individual into a busy life, marked by the living presence of none other than Christ. There were the notes he struck in a remarkably joyous spirit at the very time he was caught in the events of losing his hospital. His lecture was on the second coming of Christ. I believe that the just people in the world keep it going. The just people are the ones who have been kind to the other fellow. For we may see evidence of the Christ Spirit about us right now, day by day, in kindness, patience, long-suffering, showing brotherly love, preferring our neighbor before oneself. How soon will he come again? When we make it possible. It is made possible at least once. It will be made possible again. When we live the life he has laid out for us, we are making it possible for him, the Lord and Master of this world, to come again. I will not leave you comfortless, but I will come again and receive you unto myself, and where I am, there you may be also. Cayce's words conveyed his sense of faith as a shared search, even at a time when he knew he was to begin a new life, leaving behind the institution that had seemed the crown of his manhood. 3. Pain of others and prayer to God. The third essential of Cayce's practical mysticism was a double focus on pain of others and prayer to God. The pain of others was the underneath drumbeat of his life, the vital call that kept him trying to use his strange gifts. Without the imperative of the suffering of others, he knew that he might well have succumbed to spiritual inflation over his powers under the admiring attention of others, or might well have put aside his readings as too costly of church and community respect for himself and his family. Giving aid, lifting burdens, opening up investigations, drawing individuals toward their best selves, these alone kept the venture sensible and compelling. Cayce agreed with Paul that only their exercise in love made even remarkable powers worthwhile. Quoting the passage from 1 Corinthians, which closes the first volume of A Search for God, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am become as sounding brass or a clanging cymbal." The needed love for one's fellows, he felt, could flare into life for any man who would look about him at the pain of others, and ask himself what he wanted to do about it with God's help. Such pain need not be pain of body, like that which had made the medical readings the central work of Cayce's adult life, and had filled his days with symptoms and crises and terms and treatments not unlike those of a physician in a clinic. The pain might be the loneliness of a child or an aged person. It might be the longing for learning of an illiterate man in jail. Cayce often took his Alabama leaders in church youth work to the local jail, where they might learn to talk without condensation to those who were serving terms. It might be the privation of someone underprivileged or discriminated against. Or it might be the empty heart of someone in a sterile marriage, or the frustration of an inventive person trying to develop and market a new process. Whatever the pain which called for aid to help another help himself, Cayce was sure that it could serve others as it had served him. To keep personal successes and failures secondary, to keep him reaching constantly for divine aid, to lead him into disciplined growth through group covenants with others, to keep him from distracting or disillusioning others through any personal immorality in himself or his family, to keep him striving to understand laws rather than simply to perform feats, and to make him willing for daily sacrifices. In Cayce's instance, the sacrifice of having to go unconscious twice a day when he would far rather be alert and talk with people who came to him. Yet Cayce was equally sure that the healing and preventing of pain for others was a work that never reached its fullest potential unless it were accompanied by growth in every kind of prayer, thanksgiving, penitence, praise, dedication, adoration, meditation, and all the other unseen movements with which the human spirit responded to the Spirit of God. He did not look at praying as a mysterious art, though he knew that it was complex and demanding in its richest forms. He felt that any man could begin to work at it, and made his point by telling a migrant worker who had no religious background at all, but set about praying by reciting the letters of the alphabet in honest humility, asking God to arrange the letters into acceptable prayers. Praying aloud at least part of the time, Cayce felt, was valuable because the very sound of the voice, even holy private prayer, could awaken something important within the person. And he told his lecture audience not to be ashamed to pray upon their knees, especially when praying with all of their strength and love and hope for someone else. Such outward actions might heighten the inward expectancy. When we attempt to be very close to, or even on speaking terms with, our God, do we expect an answer? When we pray, do we always expect an answer? But the answer which Cayce meant was not alone the guidance that his reading so well exemplified, nor the providential care which man so easily put first. Rather, the answer to prayer was no less than God's gift of himself, to each man coming as growth within him. When we cry out something and call on God for it, we get it, provided our lives are in accord with what we want. For prayers are answered from within. Certainly God is within each of us, if he is everywhere else. By praying we awaken within that which we desire, and so build our lives towards the thing desired. Thus a man literally becomes that which he prays for in his heart. Cayce's mysticism of the will was evident in the stipulation that the life of the one who prayed must be in accord with the growth and service which he sought in prayer. Do you think that the will and the soul are one, and any more than a husband and wife are one? Each of you has a soul which you are carrying back to its maker. Dare to introspect for a moment, and gaze upon that which you intend to present to the all-creative power. In each of us there is a spark of that creative power. Arouse it and make your will one with it, for in so doing you will have strength, and we all need that strength, for it is a long journey. In typical mystical language, Cayce spoke of the soul's direct relationship with God, and of the long journey of growth in grace. In so doing he marked himself not as a psychic with certain mystical tendency, but as a mystic who was also a psychic. The central focus of his lectures and classes, his letters and conversations, was not new powers for men, but new men for God. He offered the only faith he knew, the one he had lived. It was practical mysticism, as down-to-earth as concern for someone's ruptured appendix, and as high as the next soul-sized prayer. It was the kind of mysticism with which a man might begin a new life.